The hiss of steam was the first sound that truly belonged to Logan's Ferry. For 3 long days, the world had been a monotonous rhythm of clattering steel on iron rails, the groan of coupling cars, and the lonely cry of the whistle across an endless, frozen prairie. But this sound, a great, weary sigh from the locomotive as it bled its power into the thin, frigid air, was a sound of arrival. It was the closing of a door on one life and the hesitant turning of a knob on another. Snow was falling. Not the heavy, blanketing snow of a Pennsylvania winter, the kind that hushed the world and promised a clean slate, but a sparse, indecisive flurry. The flakes were small and sharp, like grains of salt tossed from an indifferent sky, landing on the raw pine of the station platform without bothering to stick. They melted on the shoulders of her coat, leaving dark, damp spots on the already faded wool. Clara J. Monroe stood for a moment in the open doorway of the carriage, her hand resting on the cold brass handle. She was the last passenger to disembark. She had waited deliberately, allowing the handful of others a family with 2 boisterous children, a trio of bearded miners whose laughter was coarse and loud, a stern-faced woman in a fur-lined bonnet to descend first, hoping her intended would have an unobstructed view, a clear sight of the woman he had promised to meet. She took a deep breath, the cold air stinging the back of her throat, and stepped down. Her worn leather boots made a solid, definitive sound on the wooden planks. The train had been a world in motion, a temporary haven of anonymity. The platform was a stage, and Clara was a woman who had spent most of her life trying to avoid stages. She was tall. It was the first thing anyone ever noticed, the thing she had learned to carry with a stoop in her shoulders, a slight downward tilt of her head, as if apologizing for the space she occupied. Here, on this open platform, with the low, squat buildings of the town spread out before her like scattered kindling, her height felt more conspicuous than ever. Her face, framed by the simple brown bonnet tied beneath her chin, was full and earnest, with wide-set eyes the color of a winter sky just before dusk. It was a pleasant face, her mother had always said, a face of good sense and quiet strength, but it was not a delicate face, not the kind of face men wrote poetry about. Her coat, a deep but weary brown, had seen 3 winters too many. It was her best, the one she had painstakingly relined herself, but its color had surrendered to sun and sleet, and the nap of the wool was worn smooth at the cuffs and elbows. It hugged the solid lines of her body, a body built for kneading bread and carrying buckets of water, not for the fragile fashions she'd seen in the Godey's ladies' book that Mrs. Henderson kept in her parlor back home. She clutched her single carpet bag, its tapestry sides depicting a faded pastoral scene of sheep shepherded by a lady with an impossibly small waist. Inside was everything she owned: 2 changes of clothes, a well-used Bible, a small pouch of coins sewn into the lining, a packet of dried lavender from her mother's garden, and the bundled letters, 3 winters of letters. They were tied with a simple piece of twine, their creases worn soft with countless readings. The words of Mr. Elias Thorne. He had seen her name through a church circular that connected respectable women in the East with industrious men seeking wives in the West. His first letter had been formal, almost stiff, speaking of his work as a carpenter, the small but sturdy house he had built with his own hands, and his desire for a companion to share in the creation of a good, God-fearing home. His penmanship was neat and strong, the loops and crosses of his letters devoid of any flourish. He seemed a man of substance, of practicality. Clara, at 27, had felt the walls of her small Pennsylvania town closing in. She was the eldest of 4 daughters, and the plainest. While her sisters had married local boys, she had remained a quiet fixture in her family home, known for her skill at the church bake sales and the steady way she cared for her aging parents. She was useful. She was respected, but she was not chosen. Mr. Thorne's letters had felt like a door opening into a world where she could be more than just useful. She could be necessary. His last letter, which she knew by heart, had been clear. Asterisk. Arrive on the afternoon train, the 3rd of November. I shall be on the platform. You will know me by my gray coat and the copy of the Logan's Ferry Chronicle in my hand. I look forward to making your acquaintance in person. Miss Monroe. Asterisk. Her eyes scanned the dwindling crowd. The family was being herded into a wagon by a man who lifted his children as if they were sacks of flour. The miners had disappeared into a building across the muddy street from which the tinny sound of a piano and a burst of laughter now spilled. The stern-faced woman was embraced by a man who looked just as severe. There was no man in a gray coat, no one holding a newspaper. A cold knot began to tighten in her stomach, colder than the wind that whipped a stray strand of brown hair across her cheek. Perhaps she had been looking down when he was looking for her. She stood straighter, lifting her chin, forcing the habitual stoop from her shoulders. She turned her head slowly, her gaze sweeping from one end of the platform to the other. There was only the station master rolling a baggage cart, its iron wheels groaning in protest, and a few boys loitering near the tracks, kicking at stones. The train gave a final, shuddering gasp and began to inch backward, preparing for its return journey east. With every foot it moved. Clara felt her connection to everything she had ever known being stretched thinner and thinner, until it seemed it might snap. She was alone, utterly and completely alone on a slip of land in a territory she knew only from the stark, practical words in a man's letters. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at the edges of her composure. She told herself to be sensible. There could be 100 reasons. Perhaps his work had kept him, a last-minute job, a delivery delayed. Logan's Ferry was a busy place. He had written, a town growing with purpose. He was a practical man. He would not neglect his duties, not even for this. He would have left a message. With newfound resolve, she gripped the handle of her bag and walked toward the small, wooden station house. The sign above the door read simply, Logan's Ferry. The paint was peeling. The warmth inside was a welcome shock, thick with the smell of the pot-bellied stove that glowed a dull red in the corner. The air was heavy with the scent of burning coal, damp wool, and something else, the faint, lingering aroma of cheap tobacco. A long wooden bench sat against one wall, empty. The floor was scuffed and grimy with the mud of 100 boots. The room was a cage of practicality, built for waiting, not for comfort. Behind a window barred with a heavy iron grill sat a woman. She was watching Clara with the unblinking stillness of a hawk. Her hair was the color of ash, pulled back into a knot so tight it seemed to stretch the skin of her temples. Her face was a collection of sharp angles and thin lines, and her eyes missed nothing. Clara approached the window, placing her bag carefully on the floor beside her. She had to clear her throat before she could speak, and even then, her voice sounded small in the quiet room. "Excuse me, ma'am." The woman's gaze flickered over Clara's tall frame, from the hem of her plain dress to the simple bonnet on her head. It was not a glance, it was an inventory. "I was to be met," Clara began, her words feeling clumsy and oversized. "By a Mr. Elias Thorne. I believe he is a carpenter in this town." The woman's thin lips pressed together. A flicker of something recognition, perhaps, or something less kind passed through her eyes. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she picked up a stray ticket stub from her counter and examined it as if it held the secrets of the universe. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Clara could feel a hot flush creeping up her neck. "Thorne," the woman finally said, her voice as dry as dust. She did not look at Clara, but at the ticket stub. "Yes, I know Mr. Thorne." "Is there a message for me?" Clara pressed, a note of desperation coloring her tone. "My name is Clara Monroe." At the mention of her name, The woman finally lifted her head. She looked directly at Clara now, and the full force of her scrutiny was like a physical blow. She took in Clara's full face, her wide shoulders, her capable, ungloved hands that were clasped nervously before her. Her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Another woman, who had been quietly sweeping in the corner, paused her work, her broom held motionless. She was listening. They were all listening. The entire town, it seemed, was embodied in the gaze of this one woman behind the iron grill. The station mistress leaned forward slightly. She lowered her voice, not to a whisper of kindness or discretion, but to the sharp, intimate hiss of gossip. Her words were meant only for Clara, but they were pitched to be heard by the silence itself. She gestured with her chin toward the grimy window that looked out onto the empty platform where Clara had just been standing, a solitary, tall figure against the vast, gray sky. "Maybe," the woman murmured, the corner of her mouth twitching with a smile that held no warmth at all. "He saw you from the window." The words hung in the air, as sharp and cold as the snowflakes outside. Asterisk. Maybe he saw you from the window. It was not a suggestion. It was a verdict. The station mistress's face held a look of grim satisfaction, the kind a person gets from seeing their bleakest assumptions about the world confirmed. For a long moment, Clara could not move. She felt as if the woman had reached through the grill and stripped her bare, leaving her exposed and shivering in the center of this small, stuffy room. The shame was a physical heat, a blush that spread from her chest to the roots of her hair. She drew in a slow, ragged breath. The woman behind the grill and the sweeper in the corner were waiting for her to weep, or to rage, or to crumble. Clara would give them none of it. She lifted her chin, meeting the station mistress's hard gaze with a steadiness she did not feel. "Where might I find Mr. Thorne's carpentry shop?" she asked. Her voice was level, betraying none of the turmoil that was churning inside her. The woman's thin smile faltered for a second, surprised by the lack of a scene. "End of the main street," she said, gesturing vaguely with her head. "Past the saloon. Has a sign. You can't miss it. The implication was clear, a woman of your size. You can't miss anything." Clara nodded once, a curt, final gesture. She picked up her carpet bag, the faded sheep seeming to mock her, and turned her back on the two women. As she pushed the heavy door open, she heard a low chuckle behind her, quickly stifled. The cold air hit her again, but this time it felt like a mercy, clearing her head. The main street of Logan's Ferry was less a street than a wide, muddy trough carved between two rows of raw, unpainted buildings. Wagon wheels had churned the half-frozen ground into a treacherous landscape of deep ruts and icy puddles. The buildings stood shoulder to shoulder with false fronts that tried to give them an air of importance they did not possess. They looked temporary, as if the vast, empty prairie behind them might decide to swallow them up at any moment. She started to walk, her steps measured and deliberate, her gaze fixed on the far end of the street, but the town would not be ignored. It watched her from every window, from every doorway. As she passed the mercantile, its windows crowded with everything from sacks of flour to bolts of calico. She saw the proprietor pause in his conversation with a customer, both of them turning to stare. A curtain twitched in the window of the dressmaker's shop, where a ridiculously corseted mannequin stood sentinel. The whispers began. They were like the rustling of dry leaves, a sound at the very edge of hearing that was impossible to ignore. It followed her as she walked, a murmur that rose and fell with her passing. She didn't have to hear the words to know their shape. Asterisk tall, alone, unmarried. Each was a stone cast in her direction. In Pennsylvania, her height had been a familiar fact, a subject of gentle teasing from her father. Here, it was a spectacle. Her solitude, which on the train had felt like independence, was now an indictment. The saloon door swung open as she approached, releasing a wave of warm, stale air that smelled of beer and unwashed men. The tinny piano music faltered. A man in the doorway, his face red and bearded, stopped mid-sentence and stared, his mouth agape. From the shadows within, she felt a dozen pairs of eyes fix on her. She kept her own eyes forward, her back straight, her knuckles white where she gripped the handle of her bag. She could feel their gazes on her back long after she had passed. This was the town Mr. Thorne had described as having good, industrious folk. These were the neighbors she was meant to have, the women with whom she was supposed to share church socials, the men who would tip their hats to her as Mrs. Elias Thorne. The thought was so bitter it almost made her choke. The image she had built in her mind over 3 years of correspondence, a quiet life in a sturdy house. The scent of baking bread mingling with the scent of fresh-cut wood was dissolving like sugar in the rain. Finally, she saw it. A simple wooden sign. The letters neatly carved and painted black E. Thorne, carpenter. The shop was a long, low building attached to a small, tidy-looking house. It was just as he had described it. Smoke curled from the stone chimney of the house, a thin gray ribbon against the heavy sky. For a heart-stopping moment, hope flickered within her. Perhaps the woman at the station was just a sour gossip. Perhaps there was a simple explanation. The wide double doors of the workshop were open, and the clean, sharp scent of pine sawdust filled the air. Inside, a man was working, his back to her. He was bent over a long plank of wood, his movements with a hand plane rhythmic and sure. He was not a large man, of average height and build, wearing a clean work apron over a simple shirt. His hair was a sandy brown, neatly trimmed. Clara stopped just outside the entrance, her shadow falling across the floor. The sound of the planing stopped. He straightened up slowly and turned, wiping his hands on his apron. It was him. She knew it instantly from the small photograph he had sent her. A stiff, formal portrait where he stared unsmilingly at the camera. In person, his face was thinner, his features more pinched. He had pale blue eyes that widened in surprise when he saw her. He looked at her, then at the carpet bag in her hand, and a dark, mottled blush began to creep up his neck, staining his pale skin. He knew exactly who she was. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "Miss Monroe," he breathed, and his eyes darted nervously toward the street, as if he feared they were being watched. Which, Clara knew with a sinking certainty, they were. He stepped toward her, but stopped several feet away, creating an impassable gulf between them. He was still wiping his clean hands on his apron, a gesture of profound agitation. You have arrived," he stammered, his gaze flickering over her face, her height, her worn coat, before dropping to the sawdust-covered floor. He would not meet her eyes. "I have," she said simply, as we arranged. The silence that followed was excruciating. In that quiet, all of Clara's remaining hopes withered and died. She had imagined this moment so many times. A warm handshake, a shy smile, an offer to take her bag, an invitation into the warm house from which the smoke was rising. Instead, she was being held at bay on the threshold of his workshop, a place of business, like a customer he wished would leave. "There has been a misunderstanding," he finally managed, the words catching in his throat. He cleared it and tried again, forcing a tone of regret that sounded utterly false. "Miss Monroe, I am a man of simple needs and a quiet disposition. I had a certain picture in my mind." Clara said nothing. She stood perfectly still, her bag feeling as heavy as a stone, and waited for him to finish the execution. He took a deep breath, like a man about to dive into icy water. Logan's Ferry is a small town. A person's reputation is paramount. It is important to fit in, to be appropriate. He finally risked a quick glance at her, a look that was almost pleading, asking her to understand, to make this easy for him. And then came the final, fatal blow, delivered with the clumsy brutality of a coward. "I require a wife who is gentle," he said, the word sounding foreign and absurd on his lips. "A woman who does not draw notice." He did not say it was because she was too tall. He did not say it was because she was not pretty. He said it was because she drew notice. Her very presence was a disruption. Her existence was an inconvenience. The crime was not in her character, but in her form, in the simple, unchangeable fact of the space she occupied in the world. Clara felt a strange calmness descend upon her. The frantic panic, the shame, the hope, it all receded, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. She looked at this small, blushing man, this builder of sturdy things who was himself so fragile, and she saw him for exactly what he was, a man terrified of. The whispers she had just walked through. He wasn't rejecting her. He was rejecting the possibility of being gossiped about. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. There was nothing to argue. There was nothing to say. Her journey of 3 days and 3 years had ended here, in a cloud of pine-scented dust, with a rejection so complete it left no room for appeal. "I see," she said, and her voice was so devoid of emotion that it made him flinch. Without another word, she turned. She did not look back. She walked away from the tidy house and the sturdy workshop, back toward the muddy street. The walk back was different. Before, she had been an object of curiosity. Now, she was a story the whole town had just seen reach its conclusion. The whispers would not be questions anymore. They would be statements. She passed the saloon again, the dressmakers, the mercantile. The curtains were no longer twitching. They were pulled back. The faces were no longer hiding. They were watching openly. She was Clara J. Monroe from Pennsylvania, the tall woman who had come all this way to be told she was not wanted. A woman alone, in a town that had already made up its mind about her. She walked past the neat, white-painted church, its steeple pointing toward a sky that offered no comfort, a silent monument to a life that would never be hers. Every step was an effort, not against the mud, but against the crushing weight of their judgment. She did not know how long she stood there, in the quiet lee of the church. The building's white-painted clapboard acted as a shield, blocking her from the main street and its many eyes. Here, the world was reduced to the rough texture of the foundation stones, the frozen, unyielding earth beneath her feet, and the vast, indifferent gray of the sky. The wind was sharper, slicing around the corner of the building with a mournful whistle, carrying the scent of snow and distant wood smoke. This was the end. The finality of it was a hollow ache in her chest. She had traveled more than 1,000 miles, crossing rivers and plains, sleeping fitfully in her seat while the country unspooled outside her window. All for a 5-minute conversation that had dismantled her future. Asterisk, a woman who does not draw notice. The words echoed in her mind, each one a fresh sting of humiliation. Elias Thorne had not just rejected a potential wife. He had passed judgment on her very being. He had made her height a failing, her presence a burden. Her carpetbag sat at her feet, a pathetic, solitary monument to her folly. What was she to do? The train that had brought her was already miles away, steaming back toward a life that no longer had a place for her. The next one heading east wouldn't pass through for another day. A whole day and a night to be spent in this town, this fishbowl of cold stares and hot whispers. She had a handful of coins in the pouch sewn into her bag, enough for a meal, perhaps, but not enough for a room at the hotel. Not if she hoped to have enough left for the long journey home. The thought of home was an agony. To return would be to admit the totality of her failure. She could already hear the pitying whispers of her neighbors, see the sorrow in her mother's eyes, the quiet disappointment in her father's. Clara, the sensible one, the practical one, who had gambled everything on the words of a man she'd never met and lost. For a wild, desperate moment, she considered simply walking away, not toward the station, but away from it, away from the muddy street and the false-fronted buildings, out into the sprawling, snow-dusted prairie that began just beyond the last house. She could just walk until the town was a speck behind her, until its judgment could no longer reach her. It was a foolish, romantic notion, the kind of thing a girl in a dime novel might do, but Clara was not a girl, and this was not a story. It was a cold, hard reality, and walking into the wilderness was just a slower, more painful way to perish than staying here. A tear, hot and unexpected, escaped and traced a cold path down her cheek. She angrily wiped it away with the back of her worn wool glove. She would not cry. She had not cried in front of the station mistress, nor in front of Elias Thorne. And she would not cry now, alone behind a church in a town that despised her. She straightened her shoulders, forcing the familiar, apologetic stoop out of her spine. She was Clara J. Monroe. She was tall and she was alone, but she was not broken. She would endure the next 24 hours. She would find a way. She was just about to pick up her bag, to force herself back onto that main street and face the gauntlet once more, when a voice broke the stillness. It was a low voice, calm and unhurried, with a gravelly timbre, like stones rolling in a slow-moving river. If they're looking, let 'em look. The words were not startling, but they rooted her to the spot. They were so direct, so perfectly aimed at the turmoil in her own mind, that it felt as if the man had reached in and plucked the thought right out of her head. She turned slowly. He was leaning against the far corner of the church, one booted foot crossed over the other, his arms folded across his chest. He had been there the whole time, yet he had made no sound. He wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was simply occupying the space with a quiet stillness that made him part of the landscape. He was watching her, but his gaze was not the prying, judgmental stare of the townspeople. It was something else, steady, observant, and unreadable. He pushed himself off the wall, and the sheer size of him became apparent. He was tall, taller even than she had first thought. He wore a heavy sheepskin-lined coat that had seen years of hard wear, the leather cracked and darkened by weather. His boots were caked with a mixture of mud and what looked like hay. A plain, dark felt hat was pulled low on his brow, but she could see a shock of dark hair and the shadow of a day's worth of beard on a strong jaw. He moved with an economy of motion, a powerful grace that spoke of a life of physical labor. He took 2 long, easy strides that brought him to a stop, a respectable few feet from her. And then he did something no man had ever done. He looked her straight in the eye, not up at her, not with a flicker of surprise or a smirk of amusement. His eyes, a deep and startling blue set in a face weathered by sun and wind, were perfectly level with hers. For the first time in her life, Clara felt the strange and unfamiliar sensation of not being the tallest person in a conversation. The feeling was so profound it almost buckled her knees. It was as if a weight she hadn't even realized she was carrying had suddenly been lifted. "They got nothing better to do than stare," he said, his voice just as calm as before. It wasn't an apology for the town, or an expression of pity for her. It was a simple statement of fact. Clara found her voice, though it felt rusty. "I hadn't noticed. The lie was thin, but it was all the armor she had left." A corner of his mouth lifted in a ghost of a smile. "I expect you did." He gestured with his head back toward the main street. "Saw you at Thorne's place. He's a fool. Again, a simple fact, delivered without heat." He looked at her carpet bag, then back at her face. "You got a place to stay?" The practical question cut through her defenses. It was kind, but it was not soft. It demanded an answer. "I am making arrangements," she said, the words stiff and formal. He nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "The hotel will cost you $1 and pick your pocket for breakfast. There's a boarding house at the north end of town, run by Agnes Mayfield. She's a widow, fair-minded woman. Her rooms are clean and she won't ask questions you don't want to answer." Clara stared at him, suspicion warring with a desperate need for the very thing he was offering a safe harbor. Why was he helping her? No one in this town had offered her anything but scorn. "Why are you telling me this?" He shrugged, a simple movement of his broad shoulders beneath the heavy coat. Saw a person who might need to know. He pushed his hands into the deep pockets of his coat. He did not seem to be in any hurry. He did not seem to be anything but what he was, a tall man standing in the cold, talking to a woman who was just as tall. "I'm Weston Calhoun," he said, as if it were an afterthought. "I run the livery stable, just past Mrs. Mayfield's place." A liveryman? A man who worked with horses. It explained the mud on his boots and the quiet, powerful patience about him. He dealt with stubborn, four-legged creatures all day. The silent judgment of a small town was likely of little consequence to him. He was a man who stood apart. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and in his gaze, she saw no judgment of her height, no curiosity about her circumstances, only a quiet acknowledgment of her presence. He saw her not as an oddity, not as a rejected bride, but as a person standing in the cold who needed a place to stay. "Mrs. Mayfield's," he repeated, his voice a little softer. "Just tell her Weston sent you." And with a slight dip of his head, he turned and walked away, his long strides eating up the frozen ground. He didn't look back. He rounded the corner of the church and was gone, leaving Clara alone once more, but in a silence that felt different. The air was no longer thick with ridicule. It was just cold air. The sky was no longer mocking her. It was just a gray sky. Weston Calhoun had offered her a piece of information, a path. He hadn't offered to carry her bag or escort her. He had not treated her as a helpless female. He had treated her as an equal, someone capable of taking the information and acting on it. He had stood level with her, in more ways than one. She looked down at her bag, then up toward the north end of town, in the direction he had gone. It was a choice, to remain here, frozen by humiliation, or to take a step, to walk back into that town, not as a spectacle, but as a woman with a destination. Clara bent down, her joints stiff from the cold and from standing still for so long. She picked up her bag. The faded tapestry felt a little lighter in her hand. She took a deep breath and walked out from behind the church. If they were looking, she thought, echoing the stranger's words in her mind. Let them look. The walk to the north end of town was a different kind of trial. The stairs were still there, falling on her like a physical weight, but they were now mixed with a new, more pointed curiosity. News in a town like Logan's Ferry traveled faster than a prairie fire, and she knew the story of her brief, humiliating encounter at the carpenter's shop was already common knowledge. She was no longer just a strange, tall woman who had arrived alone. She was a strange, tall woman who had been publicly spurned. Yet, Weston Calhoun's words had forged a thin but resilient shield around her. Asterisk. If they're looking, let 'em look. The simple, stoic defiance of it echoed with each step she took on the frozen, rutted mud. She kept her eyes fixed on the path ahead, not in shame, but with a newfound, fragile sense of purpose. She had a destination. It was not the sturdy house and promising future she had crossed a country for, but it was a destination nonetheless. A boarding house, a woman named Agnes Mayfield, a chance. Mrs. Mayfield's establishment was the last house on the street, standing where the town's ambitions gave way to the vast, open prairie. It was a large, two-story clapboard structure, painted a sober gray that had weathered to the soft color of a dove's wing. Unlike the other buildings with their false, bragging fronts, it was an honest house, solid and unpretentious, with a wide front porch and tall windows that suggested generous rooms within. Smoke plumed from two stone chimneys, a welcome sign of the warmth and life it held. It looked less like a business and more like a home that had simply grown large enough to accommodate strangers. Clara mounted the 3 wooden steps to the porch, her boots making a solid, hollow sound, and knocked on the heavy oak door. For a moment, there was only silence. She could feel the town at her back, watching, waiting. She resisted the urge to look over her shoulder. The door opened, and a woman stood in the frame, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. She was a woman built of the same sturdy, practical material as her house. She was perhaps 60, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a neat but not severe bun. Her face was a map of her life, lined with the worries of a frontier existence, but also creased at the corners of her eyes and mouth with a humor that had not yet surrendered. Her eyes were a shrewd, intelligent gray, and they took in Clara in a single, sweeping glance that was assessing but not unkind. "Yes," the woman said, her voice clear and direct. "Mrs. Mayfield?" Clara asked. "I'm she. My name is Clara Monroe. Weston Calhoun. He sent me. He said you might have a room." At the mention of Weston's name, a subtle shift occurred in the woman's expression. The professional guardedness of a landlady softened into something warmer, a flicker of respect. "Weston, did he? Well, he doesn't send strays. Come in out of the cold. Child." Agnes Mayfield stepped back, holding the door wide, and Clara entered, bringing her bag and a gust of frigid air with her. The inside of the house was a haven. The air was warm and smelled wonderfully of beeswax, drying herbs, and the faint, savory scent of a simmering stew. A long, polished wooden table dominated the main room, and a fire crackled merrily in a large stone hearth. It was a room that promised comfort and order. "He said your rooms were clean and you don't ask questions," Clara said, the words coming out before she could stop them. Agnes gave a short, dry laugh. "Weston is a man of few words, and most of them are true. My rooms are clean, and I find that most questions answer themselves, given time." She looked Clara over again, her gaze lingering for a moment on Clara's height. But unlike every other person in Logan's Ferry, her expression held no surprise or judgment. It was the practical look of a woman calculating another person's ability to chop wood or carry a heavy pot. "I have a small room. At the back. It's not fancy, but it's warm. $3 a week, meals included." Clara's heart sank. $3. She had 5, and a few scattered coins. Enough for 1 week. And then, what? The uncertainty must have shown on her face. Her shoulders, which she had been holding so straight, slumped a fraction of an inch. Agnes Mayfield missed nothing. Her sharp eyes softened slightly. "It's a fair price. Boarders eat well here." She paused, her gaze thoughtful as she looked at Clara's hands, large, capable, and clean, but not the soft hands of a lady of leisure. They were the hands of a woman who knew what work was. "Weston said nothing else about you?" Agnes asked, her tone casual. "Only your name." "That is all he knows of me," Clara replied quietly. "And what else is there to know?" Agnes's voice was gentle now. She led Clara through the main room toward a door at the far end. "I have 1 room left vacant. It's beside the kitchen. Some find it noisy in the mornings, but it's the warmest spot in the house." She opened the door to a small, simple room. It held a narrow bed covered with a colorful patchwork quilt, a small wooden washstand with a basin and pitcher, a single straight-backed chair, and a wooden peg on the wall for her coat. A small window looked out onto a wind-swept yard. It was austere, but it was immaculate, and it was a sanctuary. "It will do nicely," Clara said, her voice thick with a relief so profound it was almost painful. "Good." Agnes watched as Clara set down her bag. She could see the worry still etched around the younger woman's eyes, the tension in her jaw. The landlady stood there for a moment, her head tilted, as if listening to one of those questions that was trying to answer itself. She looked at Clara's apron-clad figure, at the faint dusting of old flour still visible on the bib. "Do you bake?" Agnes asked. The question was so simple, so unexpected, that it took Clara by surprise. It was a question about doing, not about being. It was not about her height, or her marital status, or her lonely arrival. It was about a skill. "Yes," Clara said, and for the first time since stepping off the train, her voice held a note of genuine confidence. Yes, ma'am, I do. Back home, Clara elaborated, a flicker of pride in her tone. I bake the bread for the church, for all the socials and the bake sales. A slow smile spread across Agnes Mayfield's face. Is that so? The bread from the mercantile tastes like sawdust and sorrow. And my own hands, she said, holding them up. They're not what they used to be. The kneading tires them. She looked from her hands to Clara's. I've 5 boarders, not including myself, a constant need for bread and biscuits. She paused, letting the unspoken offer hang in the warm air between them. The pantry is well stocked. Flour, yeast, lard. If you were to take over the baking, I expect we could come to a different arrangement about the rent. It was a lifeline offered in the form of a sack of flour. Tears pricked at the back of Clara's eyes, but she blinked them away fiercely. She had not come all this way to be a baker in a boarding house, but the life she had come for was gone. This was a new path, one she could walk with her own 2 hands. I would like that very much, Mrs. Mayfield, she said. An hour later, Clara was no longer Clara Monroe, the rejected mail-order bride. She was a woman at work. Agnes had lent her a clean, crisp apron that tied snugly around her waist, and showed her the kitchen. It was a large, well-used room, the true heart of the house. A massive black cast-iron stove stood against one wall, radiating a steady, comforting heat. Long wooden countertops were scrubbed white, and a formidable pantry stood open, revealing tins of spices, sacks of flour and sugar, and jars of preserved fruits and vegetables. For Clara, stepping into that kitchen was like coming home. The anxieties of the town, the sting of Elias Thorne's words, the loneliness of her journey, it all began to recede. Here, she was not an object of pity or scorn. She was in her element. Her hands, which had felt so clumsy and conspicuous on the street, now moved with a familiar, confident grace. She sifted the flour, the fine white powder dusting the air. She measured the yeast, the salt, the warm water, and then she began to knead. The work was a balm to her wounded spirit. The rhythmic pushing and folding of the dough was a familiar meditation. It was an act of creation, of transformation. She was taking simple, inert ingredients and breathing life into them. She worked the dough until it was smooth and elastic, a living thing beneath her palms. Her shoulders, which had been tight with tension, began to relax. A sense of purpose, clean and strong, flowed back into her, as the loaves sat rising under a clean cloth near the warmth of the stove. She explored the pantry further and found jars of late-season apples. With Agnes's blessing, she set a pot to simmer, filling it with peeled apples, cinnamon, and a little sugar. Soon, a new scent began to fill the house, overwhelming the old smells of beeswax and stew. It was the rich, warm, almost holy aroma of baking bread, mingled with the sweet, spicy perfume of simmering apples. It was the scent of comfort, of generosity, of home. The smell did not stay contained within the walls of the boarding house. It crept from beneath the door and through the cracks in the window frames. It drifted out onto the porch and was caught by the wind. It was a scent with substance, a fragrant cloud that traveled down the muddy street. It passed the saloon, where men paused with glasses halfway to their lips, sniffing the air. It slipped into the mercantile, where the proprietor looked up from his ledgers, puzzled. It found its way to the windows of the houses, where the women who had whispered and stared now stopped their work, their faces turned toward the source of that wonderful, nostalgic smell. The town had judged Clara by what they could see, but now she was announcing herself in a different way, through a language that everyone, from the minister to the stable hand, could understand. It was an offering, an invisible message of warmth and nourishment that was the complete opposite of the cold welcome she had received. Back in the kitchen, Clara, her face lightly flushed from the heat of the stove and a fine dusting of flour on her cheekbones, pulled the first loaf from the oven. It was perfect, The crust was a deep, golden brown, and when she tapped the bottom, it answered with a satisfying, hollow sound. She placed it on a cooling rack, and its fragrance filled the room, rich and beautiful. Agnes Mayfield entered the kitchen and stopped, breathing in the aroma. She looked at the perfect loaf of bread, at the pot of apple butter simmering on the stove, and at the tall, capable woman standing by the oven, her face serene with the quiet satisfaction of work well done. Agnes nodded slowly, a look of profound approval in her shrewd gray eyes. "Well now," she said, her voice soft with contentment, "I'd say you've found your place. Clara Monroe." For a week, the kitchen at Agnes Mayfield's boarding house was a world unto itself, a warm and fragrant kingdom where Clara was the undisputed sovereign. The rhythms of her days were dictated by the needs of yeast and fire, a comforting and predictable cycle that left little room for the anxieties that had plagued her upon her arrival. She rose before the sun, the house still dark and silent, and in the quiet glow of a single kerosene lamp, she would begin. The boarders, a collection of solitary men who worked at the lumber mill or on the freight lines, began to treat her with a gruff but genuine respect. They were men who understood the value of a day's labor, and they saw in Clara a reflection of their own work ethic. They started their mornings with her hot, flaky biscuits and strong coffee, and ended their days with thick slices of her hearty bread alongside Agnes's stews. They spoke to her not of her past or her appearance, but of practical things, asking if she needed a log split for the stove or offering to carry a heavy sack of flour from the mercantile. In the small, self-contained world of the boarding house, Clara Monroe was no longer a spectacle. She was a necessity. Even Agnes, a woman not given to easy praise, would often come into the kitchen, pour herself a cup of coffee, and simply watch Clara work, a look of quiet contentment on her face. A silent, powerful bond was forming between the two women, an understanding built on shared labor and mutual respect. Clara was earning her keep, and in doing so, she was earning back a piece of herself. The shame of her rejection had not vanished, but it had been baked into the crust of 100 loaves of bread and stored away, like preserves in a cool, dark cellar. But the boarding house was an island, and Logan's Ferry was a vast and turbulent sea of opinion. The fragrant scent of baking bread that had first announced Clara's presence had, for a time, sweetened the town's perception of her. It was a novelty, a welcome improvement. Women began sending their children to Mrs. Mayfield's back door with a few coins to buy a fresh loaf, an errand that allowed them to satisfy their curiosity as well as their appetite. For a brief time, the narrative had shifted. She was the baker, the tall woman who could work magic with flour and yeast. The peace, however, was as fragile as a spun sugar confection. It could not last. A town like Logan's Ferry fed on gossip as surely as its citizens fed on bread, and a story as delicious as Clara's could not be allowed to grow stale. The novelty wore off, and suspicion, a more familiar and satisfying flavor, returned. The change began subtly. A trip to the mercantile for supplies became an exercise in silent hostility. Mrs. Henderson, the proprietor's wife, who had at first been effusive in her praise of Clara's rye bread, now served her with a clipped, cool efficiency. The other women in the store, the same ones whose curtains had twitched as she'd walked past, would fall silent when Clara entered, their conversations only resuming in tight, venomous whispers after she had passed. They no longer saw a baker. They saw a threat to the established order. The whispers found their way back to Clara, as they were always intended to do. One of the boarders, a kind, elderly man named Silas who repaired harnesses, repeated them to Agnes one evening, thinking he was doing her a service. Agnes, in turn, told Clara, not to wound her, but to arm her. The first rumor was that Clara was too forward. Her work, which had been her salvation, was reframed as a brazen performance, a proper woman, A woman of good character who had found herself in such a delicate and embarrassing situation would have remained secluded, quiet and contrite in her room. She would have shown shame. But Clara Monroe showed no shame. Instead, she had installed herself at the very heart of a house full of men, her presence and her smells dominating the north end of town. She was seen at the back door every morning, handing loaves to customers with her sleeves rolled up, a dusting of flour on her strong arms. It was unseemly. It was the behavior of a woman who was not waiting to be chosen, but was actively and improperly seeking attention. The second rumor, inevitably, involved Weston Calhoun. His initial act of kindness directing her to Agnes's house had been re-examined and found wanting. It was no longer seen as a simple decency afforded to a traveler in distress. It had been a plan. He had placed her there for his own purposes. He was seen stopping by the boarding house in the early mornings. Before his work at the livery began in earnest, he would stand on the back porch, a tin mug of coffee in his large hands, talking quietly with Clara while she waited for her ovens to heat. To any sensible observer, it was a neighborly moment. To the gossips of Logan's Ferry, it was a daily, clandestine meeting. A quiet, solitary man like Weston Calhoun did not suddenly change his habits for no reason. He was paying Clara Monroe entirely too much mind. And for a man to pay that much mind to an unattached woman of her stature and circumstance, there could be only one explanation. This led to the third, and most poisonous. Rumor that Agnes Mayfield's respectable kitchen had become something else entirely. It became a place where men, the boarders, and Weston Calhoun in particular, were said to congregate at all hours. The talk painted a picture of Clara, flushed and bold in the heat of her kitchen, entertaining a revolving cast of male admirers. The simple, innocent act of a man fetching a biscuit was twisted into something sordid. The reputation Agnes had spent 20 years building as a God-fearing, hard-working widow was being tarnished by the woman she had taken in. The weight of the talk began to wear on Clara. The joy she found in her work was now tinged with a constant, weary defensiveness. The kitchen, once her sanctuary, now felt like a stage, its windows like eyes watching her every move. She began to lower the curtains, even on sunny days. She became quieter with the boarders, more reserved, terrified that any simple kindness or friendly word would be misconstrued and used as further evidence against her. One afternoon, as she was returning from the post office, she saw Elias Thorne. He was walking on the other side of the street with a woman, a petite, doll-like creature with blonde curls and a timid, downward gaze. He saw Clara, and his face instantly flushed that familiar, blotchy red. He quickly took the woman's arm and steered her into the dressmaker's shop. A man fleeing the scene of his own crime. It was a small, telling moment. He had chosen a woman who did not draw notice, a woman who would fold herself neatly into the town's expectations. He had chosen a woman who was everything Clara was not. The sight of them, of his casual, public cowardice, hurt more than she expected. That evening, Weston stopped by as he often did, leading a horse he was taking to a farm north of town. The sun was setting, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. Clara was on the back porch, peeling potatoes for the evening meal, her movements slow and heavy. He tethered the horse to the porch rail and approached, stopping at the bottom of the steps. He took off his hat, running a hand through his dark, unruly hair. "Evening, Clara," he said, his voice as calm and steady as ever. "Mr. Calhoun," she replied, not looking up from her work. Her knife scraped against the potato with a harsh, angry sound. He was quiet for a long moment, simply watching her. He had an animal's sensitivity to moods, and he could feel the wall of misery she had built around herself. "Agnes tells me the mercantile is short on cinnamon." It was his way of opening a door, of acknowledging that he knew she was having a hard time. Clara finally stopped her peeling and looked at him. Her eyes were full of a weary pain that made his chest ache. "Is that what they're saying at the mercantile?" she asked. her voice laced with a bitterness that was foreign to her. "Or are they talking about the company I keep in the mornings?" Weston's expression didn't change. He absorbed her anger without flinching. He leaned his shoulder against the porch post, his gaze fixed on her. "Some folks," he said slowly, "have got so much emptiness inside 'em. They got to fill it up with the noise. Only thing they know how to make is ugly sounds. They are saying that I am improper," she said, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. "That this," she gestured vaguely between them, "that it is improper. They are ruining Mrs. Mayfield's good name because of me." She expected him to be angry, or defensive, or embarrassed. She expected him to say that perhaps it would be better if he didn't stop by anymore, to sever their connection for the sake of propriety, just as Elias Thorne would have done. Instead, Weston Calhoun did none of those things. He looked away from her, his gaze settling on the distant prairie, where the last light of day was dying. He seemed to be considering the vast, silent emptiness of the land, a place where a man's worth was measured by his resilience, not by the opinions of others. Then he looked back at her, his blue eyes clear and direct. He gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug, a gesture of such profound indifference to the town and its chatter that it startled her. "They talk," he said, his voice low and certain, "but they don't know a thing." And that was all. He did not offer empty reassurances or make grand promises to defend her honor. He simply stated a truth as solid and unchangeable as the earth beneath their feet. They talk, but they don't know. He separated the noise from the reality, the whispers from the truth. In that one simple sentence, he handed her a shield. He held her gaze for a second longer, then straightened up. "You tell Agnes I'll look for Cinnamon over at Miller's Crossing tomorrow." He put his hat back on, untied his horse, and with a quiet nod, he led the animal away into the gathering dusk, leaving Clara alone on the porch with a bowl of half-peeled potatoes and a strange, new lightness in her heart. The whispers were still out there, hiding in the shadows of the town, but they seemed smaller now, their power diminished, their ugly sounds fading against the vast, quiet truth of a western sky. The coming of the winter fair was, for most of Logan's Ferry, a cause for celebration. It was a reprieve from the biting monotony of the season, a chance to gather in the relative warmth of the town hall, to stomp the feeling back into their feet to the tune of a fiddle, and to feel, for one night, like a community. For Clara, the news of it was a summons to her own trial. The thought of facing the entire town, gathered together in one brightly lit room, was enough to make her hands tremble and her stomach clench into a cold, hard knot. "Nonsense, child," Agnes Mayfield had said, bustling into the kitchen where Clara was polishing off the last of a batch of apple butter. "You'll go, and you'll hold your head high. Half the reason they're having this fair is to get a taste of your pumpkin pies. You're not just a guest. You're the main attraction." Clara had protested, her arguments weak against Agnes's formidable certainty. She had no proper dress. She had no desire to be stared at. She would be perfectly content to stay behind and tend the fire. "I have a bolt of brown wool I've been saving. And you have hands more nimble with a needle than mine," Agnes had countered, dismissing her first excuse. As for the second, she'd simply fixed Clara with her shrewd gray eyes. "They'll stare whether you're there or not. Better to let them do it to your face than to your back." The logic was as unassailable as Weston Calhoun's had been. Asterisk, let 'em look. It was becoming a refrain in her mind, a quiet battle cry against her own instinct to hide. And so, in the evenings leading up to the fair, after the last of the bread was baked and the kitchen was clean, Clara sat by the fire in the main room, her needle flashing in the lamplight. The dress she made was a reflection of herself. It was not fashioned from the pages of a Godey's lady's book, with a pinched waist and a cascade of ruffles. It was made of the sturdy, earth-brown wool Agnes had given her, cut along simple, practical lines that followed the solid shape of her body without apology. It was the color of rich soil, of winter bark, of steadfastness. It was a dress for a woman who worked, not for a girl who waited. And yet, she allowed herself one small concession to vanity, one quiet act of defiance. From a remnant of scarlet cloth she'd found in Agnes's sewing basket, she fashioned a simple ribbon, the color of brick, and tied it at her throat. It was a single, defiant splash of warmth against the sober brown, a secret declaration that her spirit was not entirely subdued. The town hall was ablaze with light and noise, a wave of oppressive heat, thick with the smells of damp wool, mulled cider, roasted pumpkin, and sweating humanity, washed over them as they entered. A trio of fiddlers sawed away on a makeshift stage in the corner, their cheerful, frantic tune barely rising above the cacophony of voices. Long tables groaned under the weight of pies, cakes, and jars of preserves, all vying for a prize ribbon. At one end of the room, a boisterous game of candy pulling was underway, children's shrieks of laughter punctuating the general din. As Clara and Agnes stepped through the doorway, a sudden and perceptible hush fell over the room. Conversations faltered, heads turned. It was exactly as she had feared. In an instant, she was once again the spectacle, the subject of 100 silent questions and 1,000 unspoken judgments. She felt the familiar, hot blush creep up her neck, and her eyes instinctively dropped to the rough-hewn floorboards. She wanted to turn and flee, to run back to the quiet sanctuary of Agnes's kitchen. But Agnes's hand was firm on her elbow. "The pie table is this way," she said, her voice clear and carrying, and she propelled Clara forward. They navigated the sea of bodies, Clara keeping her eyes fixed on the laden tables, a safe harbor in a storm of stairs. She carried the 2 large pumpkin pies she had baked that afternoon, their spicy, sweet scent a fragile shield. Setting them down among the other entries gave her something to do, a purpose that grounded her. She arranged them just so, fussing with their placement long after it was necessary. Anything to avoid looking up, to avoid facing the collective gaze of the town. She found a place near the wall, beside a stack of firewood for the large stoves, and tried to make herself small, an impossible task for a woman of her height. Agnes, a social creature, was quickly drawn into a conversation with the minister's wife, leaving Clara adrift. She watched the dancers, the couples twirling and stomping, their faces flushed with exertion and merriment. She saw Elias Thorne dancing with the petite blonde woman. He held her carefully, as if she were made of spun glass. He did not look in Clara's direction, but she could feel his awareness of her, a tense, guilty energy radiating from him across the crowded room. She felt a presence at her side, as quiet and solid as an old tree. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. The rest of the room was a chaotic whirl of noise and motion, but the space around him seemed to hold a pocket of stillness. She looked up. Weston Calhoun stood there, looking just as out of place and just as comfortable as she felt. He was not dressed for a party. He wore the same sturdy boots and dark trousers as always, with a clean but well-worn blue shirt. He held no cup of cider, made no move to join any conversation. He was simply there, his steady blue eyes watching the dancers with a detached, unreadable expression. He turned his head and looked at her. His gaze was direct, acknowledging her presence without a word. The fiddlers, after a brief, wheezing pause, struck up a new melody. It was not one of the wild, foot-stomping reels, but a slower, more mournful tune, a waltz that spoke of long winters and lonely prairies. He did not ask, he did not say a word. He simply held out his hand. It was a large hand, calloused and capable, the hand of a man who gentled horses and mended harnesses. It was not a gentleman's hand, soft and manicured. It was a working man's hand, offered to her openly, simply, in the middle of the crowded town hall, in front of everyone. Clara stared at it, her heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic, trapped bird. To take his hand would be an irrevocable act. It would be a public declaration, a confirmation of every whisper, every piece of gossip. It would tie her to him in the town's imagination, for better or for worse. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at her to refuse, to shake her head, to murmur an excuse and retreat further into the shadows. But then she lifted her eyes from his hand to his face. There was no plea in his expression, no challenge. There was only a quiet, unwavering calm. He was not afraid of their stares. He was not afraid of their whispers. He was a man who stood his ground, and his hand, held out in the open, was an invitation for her to stand with him. It was an offer not of rescue, but of solidarity. Slowly, as if in a dream, she lifted her own hand and placed it in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong, and the contact was like an anchor in a swirling sea. He led her onto the floor. The hush that fell this time was different. It was not the silence of surprise, but of rapt, disbelieving attention. The whispers were no longer a subtle rustle. They were a sharp, sibilant hiss that followed them to the center of the room. Clara could feel the heat of 100 pairs of eyes on her back. As Weston put his other hand on her waist and they began to move to the slow, 3-beat rhythm of the waltz, her gaze dropped to the floor. She watched their feet, his large, muddy boots and her own plain, worn shoes, moving together in a simple, repeating pattern. She focused on the rough texture of his shirt beneath her hand, on the steady rhythm of his breathing, anything to avoid the ring of hostile, curious faces that surrounded them. He was a good dancer, not graceful, but steady and sure. He led with a quiet confidence that made it easy to follow. And for the first time, she was dancing with a man whose head was not somewhere below her own. Their eyes, if she dared to lift hers, would be level. She did not have to stoop, did not have to fold herself down to fit. For the first time, she felt the simple, forgotten grace of her own height. He didn't speak. He just held her, firmly and respectfully, and guided her through the music. The silence between them was more comforting than any words could have been. And in that silence, she felt his own quiet courage seeping into her, a steadying warmth against the chill of the town's judgment. She remembered his voice, behind the church, in the dusk on Agnes's porch. Asterisk. Let him look. She took a breath. It was a shaky, shallow thing, but it was a start. She lifted her head. Slowly, deliberately. She raised her eyes from the safe harbor of his shoulder. She looked out at the circle of spectators. She met the sharp, hawk-like gaze of Mrs. Gable, the station mistress, and did not flinch. She saw Mrs. Henderson from the Mercantile, her mouth a tight, disapproving line, and held her stare. Her eyes swept past faces tight with envy, with scorn, with simple, open-mouthed curiosity. She saw Elias Thorne standing frozen in a corner, the pretty, doll-like woman forgotten at his side, his face a pale mask of disbelief. She looked at them all. Her gaze was not angry, it was not defiant, it was not pleading. It was simply level. For the first time since she had stepped off the train in Logan's Ferry, she was not shrinking from their judgment. She was meeting it. She was seeing them, just as they were seeing her. She was no longer just a story they told one another, an object of their pity and scorn. She was a woman, tall and strong, dancing in the arms of a quiet man in the center of the room. The music swelled, the lonely fiddle singing its heart out, and Clara kept her head held high. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, what new whispers would follow this night, but in this one transcendent moment, she was not afraid. She was dancing, and she was finally, truly, looking back. The dance at the winter fair did not quell the whispers. It gave them a new and sharper edge. Before, Clara had been an object of pity and suspicion. Now, having publicly accepted Weston Calhoun's hand, she was seen as an instigator, a woman who, far from accepting her lowly position, was actively defying the town's unspoken laws. Their single, silent waltz was interpreted as a brazen challenge. The invisible line that had been drawn around her was now one she and Weston stood on together, and the townsfolk of Logan's Ferry retreated to their side, their gazes colder, their doors closing more firmly than before. Clara felt the change in 1,000 small, cutting ways at the mercantile. Her money was taken with a silent contempt. Children who once shyly approached her for a broken biscuit were now pulled away by their mothers. The gossip was no longer a rustle of dry leaves. It was the hiss of a coiled snake. She and Weston had made their stand, and the town, in return, was making its own. The days grew shorter, the cold deeper. Winter settled over the prairie with a grim finality. One night, the wind rose. It was a wild, malevolent gale that screamed down from the north, a living thing that clawed at the roofs and rattled the window panes of Agnes Mayfield's boarding house. It was a wind that carried the scent of ice and desolation, a wind that promised to tear away anything not firmly rooted. Clara was in the kitchen, unable to sleep. The house groaned around her, and the sound of the wind was a lonely, menacing cry that seemed to seep through the very walls. She sat at the long wooden table, a cup of chamomile tea growing cold in her hands, a feeling of deep unease settling over her. The world felt unbalanced, as if something, somewhere, was about to break. It was just after midnight when the first cry tore through the howl of the wind. Fire. The word was a jolt of pure terror in a town built of tinder-dry wood. It was followed by another shout, and then the frantic, discordant clang of the fire bell began to slice through the night. Doors slammed open. Men's voices, rough with sleep and alarm, yelled in the street. Clara's heart seized. She ran to the window, wiping the condensation from the cold glass against the turbulent, inky sky. A terrible orange light was pulsing, painting the bellies of the low-scudding clouds a sickening, flickering red. The glow was coming from the north end of town, from the livery stable. "Weston?" she breathed, the name a prayer and a curse. The boarding house emptied into the street, Agnes pulling a heavy shawl over her nightdress, the male boarders struggling into boots and coats as they ran. The wind, now their enemy, snatched the breath from their lungs and whipped the flames into a frenzy. The stable was not just burning, it was being consumed, a roaring inferno that threw sparks and burning embers high into the violent sky. The scene was one of chaos and desperation. A bucket brigade had formed, a thin, hopelessly inadequate line of men passing sloshing pails from the town well. The water hissed into steam and vanished the moment it touched the flames. The heat was a physical blow, driving people back. But worse than the heat was the sound, the terrible, high-pitched screaming of the horses trapped inside. Clara's eyes frantically searched the chaos for one person. She saw him then, a silhouette against the roaring fire, his tall frame unmistakable. Weston was not shouting. He was working, moving with a desperate, focused calm, his face a grim mask of soot. He had managed to get the main doors open, and several horses had already bolted out, their eyes wide with terror, their coats singed. He was directing the bucket brigade, pointing to where the water might do the most good, trying to save the tack and wagons near the far end of the barn. Suddenly, a bay mare galloped out of the inferno, her mane alight with tiny flames. She circled wildly in the muddy yard, whinnying in terror, looking back toward the barn. "The foal," someone yelled. "Her foal is still inside." A collective groan went through the crowd. The main roof of the stable was groaning, a deep, guttural sound of surrender. To go back inside was madness. "Let it go!" Calhoun, a man shouted, grabbing Weston's arm as he started toward the doorway. "It's not worth your life." Weston shook him off without a word. He pulled his hat down low, ripped a wet bandana from another man's hand and tied it over his face, and plunged back into the blazing maw of the stable. The crowd held its breath. The seconds stretched into an eternity, marked only by the roar of the fire and the scream of the wind. The groaning of the roof grew louder, more insistent, and then, just as a collective sigh of despair went through the onlookers, he emerged. He stumbled out of the smoke and flames, his shirt smoldering, his face black with soot. Cradled in his arms was a terrified, long-legged foal, its coat wet and steaming. He took 3 steps into the yard, pushing the foal toward its frantic mother. And then the world seemed to collapse. With a sound like a thunderclap, a massive crossbeam burned through at its center, gave way. It fell in an avalanche of fire and splintered wood. Catching the edge of the doorway where Weston had just been standing, he tried to leap clear, but he was not fast enough. The end of the beam struck him, a glancing but brutal blow that sent him sprawling to the muddy ground. Several men rushed forward and dragged him away from the intense heat. The fire, having consumed its prize, roared its victory to the sky. There was nothing left to save. Clara felt rooted to the spot, her hands pressed to her mouth, a silent scream trapped in her throat. She watched as they helped Weston to sit up. He was alive, conscious, but his face was contorted in pain. His left arm and shoulder were scorched. The sleeve of his shirt burned away in patches, and he cradled it against his chest. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle beneath him. The energy of the crowd began to shift. The frantic effort of the firefight gave way to the low, shocked murmurings of the aftermath. As the flames began to die down, the whispers began to rise, in the flickering, hellish light, amidst the swirling smoke. Clara found herself on the edge of a small group of men huddled together. Their faces were grim, their voices low. "A pure accident," one of them said, a little too loudly. "This wind, a stray spark from the stove is all it would take." "An accident," another man agreed, but he wouldn't meet the first man's eyes. And then, a third voice, low and venomous, a whisper that sliced through Clara's soul. "Serves him right. Sticking his nose where it ain't wanted. A man's gotta learn. And someone had to teach that woman a lesson." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. Her blood ran cold. Asterisk, teach that woman a lesson. This wasn't an accident. This was a message, delivered with fire and malice. A punishment for a dance, for a quiet conversation on a porch, for the simple crime of standing tall. This was her fault. The ruins of the stable, the terrified horses, the man lying injured in the mud, it was all her doing. The group of men dispersed, melting back into the shadows, leaving their poison to hang in the smoky air. The rest of the town began to retreat as well, pulling away from the disaster. Their duty done. They retreated into their homes and into their own hushed conversations, their own blame. Clara could hear the fragments as they passed. Asterisk always knew those Miller boys were trouble. Asterisk, asterisk. Should have run him out of town after that business last spring. Asterisk, asterisk. This is what happens when folks don't mind their place. Asterisk. They were turning on each other. A community splintering under the weight of a shared and unspoken guilt. But no one went to Weston. He sat alone in the mud, his back against a wagon wheel, his head bowed in pain and defeat as he stared at the smoldering skeleton of his life's work. Clara began to move. She walked past the whispering, accusing townspeople, past the curtain of smoke and the dying flames. She ignored their curious, guilty stares. Her world had narrowed to the solitary figure slumped by the wagon. She knelt in the mud beside him, heedless of her dress, of the grime, of the eyes that were still watching. "Weston," she said, her voice soft but steady. He looked up, his face a mask of pain, his blue eyes clouded with shock. He saw her, and for a moment, something in his expression shifted, a flicker of raw, unguarded relief. "Clara," he breathed. "Let me see your arm," she said, her voice taking on the practical, commanding tone she used in her kitchen. There was no room for hysterics, no time for guilt. There was only the present, pressing need. While the town blamed itself in the shadows, Clara stayed. She gently tore a strip from her petticoat and, using water from a discarded bucket, began to clean the soot from his burns. She was the only one who did not turn away. In the ruins of the livery, surrounded by the smoke of a fire that was meant to drive her out. She held her ground, her hands gentle and sure, the one constant solitary light in Weston Calhoun's darkening world. The weeks that followed the fire were a purgatory of smoke and whispers. The blackened, skeletal remains of the livery stable stood as a constant, grim monument at the end of the street, its charred timbers pointing like accusing fingers at the sky. The wind, no longer a wild gale, now seemed to carry the lingering stench of ash and ruin through the town, a daily reminder of the violence that had been done. Weston Calhoun was moved into the small, vacant room at the back of Agnes Mayfield's boarding house, the very room that had first been Clara's sanctuary. His leg, the doctor had determined, was broken, and his arm and shoulder were a painful landscape of angry red burns. He was confined to the bed, a man of constant motion now trapped in a state of enforced stillness, his quiet strength muted by a constant, grinding pain. Clara became his nurse. The kitchen, once her sole domain, now shared its importance with the sick room. Her days were a rotation of duties, rising in the pre-dawn cold to bake the day's bread, then carrying a tray to Weston's room, her own hands now skilled at changing bandages as well as kneading dough. She moved with a quiet, fierce efficiency, her grief and guilt over the fire channeled into a relentless campaign against his pain. She changed his dressings, spooned broth into his mouth when the fever was high, and sat in a straight-backed chair by his bed in the long, quiet hours of the night, simply being present while he fought his way through the darkness. A strange and profound intimacy grew between them in that small, quiet room. They spoke little, but a language of gestures and glances developed, the way he would watch her as she moved about the room, his blue eyes following her with an intensity that had nothing to do with need and everything to do with a deeper, unspoken acknowledgement. The way her hand would linger for a fraction of a second on his uninjured shoulder, a silent offering of comfort. In his vulnerability, Clara saw the true depth of his strength, and in her tireless care, he saw the unwavering core of her character. The town had tried to burn them apart, and in doing so, had forged a bond between them stronger than steel. Outside the walls of the boarding house, the town was eating itself alive with blame. The fire had cracked the community's thin veneer of civility, and the ugliness that had been directed at Clara and Weston now turned inward. Old grudges resurfaced. Families accused each other. The Miller boys, a trio of known troublemakers, were openly blamed by some, but they had ironclad alibis from a poker game miles away. The whispers that Clara had overheard teach that woman a lesson were never spoken aloud in the light of day, but they festered in the shadows, a shared, unspoken sin that made everyone complicit and everyone eager to point a finger elsewhere. Elias Thorne, the carpenter, found himself in a particularly uncomfortable position. As a man who had publicly rejected Clara, he felt the town's unease keenly. His own quiet, respectable life was now uncomfortably adjacent to the violent scandal that had engulfed her. He felt a need to distance himself further, to reaffirm the righteousness of his decision, to prove to himself and to everyone else that he had made the correct, safe choice. He did this by becoming one of the loudest voices in the chorus of condemnation, not of the fire's perpetrators, but of its victims. One raw, gray afternoon, nearly a month after the fire, Clara had to venture out. Weston's fever had finally broken, but he was weak, and the doctor had prescribed a tonic, available only from a small supply he kept in his office next to the saloon. Agnes had offered to go, but Clara insisted. The short walk, the cold air, would be a welcome, if temporary, escape from the suffocating confines of the sick room. She wrapped a heavy shawl around her shoulders and stepped out into the street. The town felt hostile, the stares of the few people she passed colder and harder than ever. She was the walking embodiment of their shared guilt, and they hated her for it. As she approached the center of town, the bat-wing doors of the saloon swung open, and a wave of raucous male laughter spilled out into the street. It was the only place in Logan's Ferry that seemed to be thriving on the town's misery. Through the doors, she could see a group of men clustered around the bar, Elias Thorne among them. He was holding a glass of whiskey, his face flushed, his voice louder and more confident than she had ever heard it. He was holding court, basking in the attention of the other men. She was about to hurry past, her gaze fixed on the doctor's shingle just beyond, when his voice, raised to carry across the room, stopped her cold. "And that's the thing of it," Elias was saying, his words slurring slightly. "A man has to be careful. A man has to choose a wife who brings him respect, not trouble. A good, quiet woman." He took a swig of his whiskey, preening under the approving nods of the other men. He was rewriting history, casting his cowardice as wisdom. Clara froze on the boardwalk, hidden from his sight by the angle of the doorway. She knew she should walk away, that no good could come from listening, but she was trapped. That tall one, she was nothing but trouble from the moment she stepped off the train, Elias continued, his voice dripping with sanctimonious pity. "And look what's become of her. Tied herself to that hot-headed liveryman. And now they've got nothing but a pile of ashes and the whole town whispering their names." He chuckled, a nasty, self-satisfied sound. He leaned back against the bar, the king of his small, squalid castle, and delivered his triumphant, final judgment. "I ask you, boys," he said, his voice ringing with false sincerity, "who would marry a woman the whole town whispers about?" The words were a physical blow. They landed in the center of Clara's soul, a precise and poison-tipped dart aimed at her deepest wound. It was the summation of every judgment she had ever faced, the articulation of her greatest fear that she was, and always would be, defined not by who she was, but by what others said about her. Something inside her, something that had been bent and bruised but never broken, finally snapped. The shame, the fear, the long-suffering patience, it all fell away, burned to ash like the timbers of the livery. What was left was a core of pure, cold anger, an anger that was as clean and righteous as a prairie fire. She took a breath. She squared her shoulders, pulling the shawl tighter around her, not for warmth, but like a warrior settling a shield into place. And she began to walk. She did not hurry past the saloon. She turned and walked directly toward the swinging doors. She pushed them open and stepped inside. The saloon fell silent. The sudden cessation of noise was so complete it was like a thunderclap. The piano player's hands froze above the keys. Men holding glasses to their lips stopped mid-sip. Every single face in that smoky, whiskey-soaked room turned toward the doorway, toward the tall woman who stood there, her face pale but resolute, her eyes blazing with a light they had never seen before. Elias Thorne was the last to turn. He saw the collective gaze of the room shift, and a drunken, confused smile was still on his face as he looked over his shoulder. When he saw her, the color drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, mottled gray. The whiskey glass slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers and shattered on the floor. Clara's gaze was fixed on him. She ignored the other men, the bartender frozen with a rag in his hand, the shocked and frightened faces all around her. She saw only the man who had judged her, scorned her, and now slandered her. She walked forward, her steps slow and deliberate on the sawdust-covered floor. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The silence in the room was so profound that her words, when they came, landed with the weight of stones. She stopped a few feet from him, standing at her full height, her presence seeming to fill the entire room. "You ask who would marry a woman the whole town whispers about. Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice low, clear, and utterly devoid of fear. He could only stare at her, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a hook. Clara's gaze swept over him, a look of such profound and pitying contempt that it made him shrink. Then she looked past him, her eyes meeting the gazes of the other men, one by one, holding each for a beat before moving to the next. "I will tell you who," she said, her voice resonating with the absolute certainty of a truth finally spoken aloud. "A man who doesn't need a town to tell him what has value." She held the silence for a moment longer, letting her words sink in, letting them see the reflection of their own smallness in her unwavering strength. She had not come to plead her case, she had come to deliver a verdict. And then, as quietly as she had entered, she turned her back on Elias Thorne and the stunned silence of the saloon and walked out. She stepped back onto the boardwalk, her heart hammering, her hands shaking, but her spirit soaring. She had done it. She had faced them all and spoken her truth. She had not hidden. As her eyes adjusted to the gray afternoon light, she saw a figure leaning against the porch post of the doctor's office, a rough-hewn crutch resting beside him. Weston. He had followed her. His face was pale and drawn with the effort of the walk, but his eyes were on her, and they were shining. He had seen it all. He had heard it all. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply looked at her, and in his gaze was a universe of emotion, respect, admiration, a fierce and tender pride that was so profound it brought tears to her eyes. It was the look of a man who had just seen his own heart's conviction given a voice, a man who had just witnessed a battle he could not fight be won for him, and for them, by the woman he pushed himself off the post, his movement clumsy with his injury but filled with an undeniable urgency. He reached out his good hand, not to steady himself, but for her. Clara took it, her fingers lacing through his, a silent and complete affirmation. The whispers of the town were still there, but they had become a meaningless, distant noise, like the buzz of insects on a hot summer day. All that mattered was the solid warmth of his hand, and the proud, unwavering light in his eyes. The day Clara walked out of the saloon, she did not walk back to the boarding house alone. Weston was beside her, his hand firmly in hers, his uneven, crutch-assisted gait a stark contrast to the unshakable strength of his grip. They did not speak. There was no need. Her public declaration and his silent, proud presence had said everything that mattered. They had drawn a new line, not in the sand, but in the very bedrock of Logan's Ferry. From that day forward, they were no longer two separate individuals weathering a storm. They were a single unit, a quiet, formidable island against which the town's turbulent gossip would break and recede. As winter's iron grip began to loosen and the prairie thawed into a sea of mud and new possibilities, the work began. The first order of business was to clear the wreckage. It was a grim, back-breaking task. Sifting through the ashes of a life's work, the town, for the most part, kept its distance. The men who had whispered in the shadows after the fire now found urgent business elsewhere whenever Weston and Clara were at the site. Their guilt was a palpable thing, a wall of silence and averted gazes. But they were not entirely alone. On the third day of the cleanup, old Silas, the harness maker, appeared with a sturdy wheelbarrow and a pair of leather work gloves. He didn't say much, just spat on his palms and set to work, his presence a quiet rebuke to the rest of the town. A few days later, two of the boarders from Agnes's house appeared after their shifts at the lumber mill, their axes and saws ready. Agnes herself was a constant presence, arriving twice a day with a basket laden with hot coffee, thick sandwiches, and a determination as solid as the foundation stones they would soon lay. Weston, his leg still healing, directed the work from a wooden crate, his voice quiet but his instructions clear and precise. He was a builder, and the loss of his stable had not robbed him of his knowledge. He drew plans in the dirt with a stick, his vision for the new structure already fully formed in his mind. Clara worked alongside the men. She hauled away blackened debris, her arms, strong from kneading dough, finding a new strength in lifting and carrying. She learned to mix mortar, to score lumber, to drive a nail straight and true. She worked with a fierce, focused energy, pouring all her sorrow and anger into the constructive act of building. The clean scent of fresh sawn pine began to replace the smell of ash, and with it, The hope of a new beginning began to feel real. They built the new stable first, smaller than the original but sturdier, its beams set deep and its roof pitched steep against the winter snows. And behind it, where a small tack shed had once stood, they built a house. It was not the tidy, respectable house that Elias Thorne had built for a wife he could not value. It was a cabin, born of necessity and partnership. It had one large main room that would serve as a kitchen and parlor, a small bedroom, and a wide porch that looked out not toward the judgmental eyes of the town, but west, toward the endless open prairie and the setting sun. The day they moved in was a quiet affair. There was no celebration, no housewarming. They simply carried their few possessions from the boarding house, Clara's carpet bag, a box of kitchen things from Agnes, the patchwork quilt that had covered Weston's sickbed, and placed them in their new home. The cabin was a world of their own making. The walls smelled of pine and fresh whitewash. The simple calico curtains Clara had sewn for the windows softened the harsh prairie light into a warm, gentle glow. A fire crackled in the new stone hearth, and a pot of stew simmered on the small cast-iron stove. It was not much, but every nail, every plank, every stone was a testament to their resilience. It was a home built not on promises, but on the hard-won truth of shared labor and unwavering loyalty. Their life together settled into a new rhythm, a quiet domesticity that was more profound than any spoken vow. Love, for them, was not in grand declarations, but in the small, everyday acts of care. It was in the way he would bring her a pail of fresh water in the morning without being asked, or the way she would have a hot meal waiting for him when he came in from the stable, weary and smelling of horses and hay. It was in the comfortable silence that could stretch between them for hours, a silence born not of a lack of things to say, but of a complete and total understanding that required no words. They were married in every way that mattered, their union consecrated not by a minister, but by fire and work and a shared, quiet courage. But the town had a long memory. The whispers had never truly died. They had merely retreated, biding their time. As Weston's business began to slowly rebuild, as a few ranchers, impressed by his fortitude, began to bring him horses to board and train, a new wave of resentment began to fester. Their defiance had been successful, and success, in the face of the town's disapproval, was the most unforgivable sin of all. One late afternoon, as the autumn sun slanted low across the prairie, Clara was sitting at the table, mending one of Weston's shirts. He was on the porch, mending a bridle, the rhythmic scrape of his knife a comforting, familiar sound. The door opened and Agnes Mayfield entered, a basket over her arm. Her face, usually so composed, was troubled. "I was at the mercantile," she said, her voice tight. "Mrs. Henderson was there, and that woman from the train station. They were talking." Clara put down her sewing, her hands suddenly still. "What about Agnes?" Agnes set her basket on the table with a thud. "About you, about this house, saying it's a disgrace, that no decent woman would live so openly, without the sanction of the church." She looked at Clara, her eyes full of a fierce, protective anger. "They're vipers, the lot of them." A shadow passed over Clara's face. It was a flicker of the old pain, the familiar sting of being judged and found wanting. After everything, the fire, the work, the home they had built, were they still to be haunted by the petty, venomous whispers of small-minded people? Weston appeared in the doorway, drawn by the change in tone. He had heard. He looked at Agnes, then at Clara, at the shadow on her face. He moved to her side, placing his good hand on her shoulder. The warmth of his touch was a solid, grounding presence. He looked out the open door, toward the town that lay just beyond the rise. He could not see the faces, but he could feel their collective, unblinking stare. His jaw tightened for a moment, and then relaxed. He had fought his war with the town and had chosen his peace. He looked down at Clara, His gaze soft. "Let them talk," he said. The words were the same ones he had spoken before, but they held a new weight now, a new finality. They were not just a reassurance. They were the founding principle of the life they had built together. Clara looked up at him, at the quiet certainty in his eyes. She took a deep breath, and the shadow on her face began to recede. She stood up from the table, without a word. She walked to the single large window in the front of the cabin, the one that looked out toward the main street of Logan's Ferry. She stood there for a long moment, her hand resting on the simple wooden frame. She looked at the town, at the collection of buildings that had been the backdrop for her deepest humiliation and her greatest triumph. She saw the steeple of the church, the false front of the saloon, the roof of the mercantile. It was a world of whispers, of judgments, of smallness. It was the world she had fought so hard to survive. Then, she reached out and took hold of the edge of the simple calico curtain. With a slow, deliberate motion, she drew it closed. The curtain slid across the window with a soft, final asterisk, shush asterisk. The harsh, slanting light of the late afternoon was instantly cut off, replaced by the warm, gentle glow of the firelight within the cabin. The room, which had been open to the world, was now a private, intimate space, a self-contained universe of their own making. Clara turned her back to the window, to the town, to the fading light of the day. She looked at Weston, who was watching her with an expression of profound love and understanding. The noise of the outside world was gone. All that was left was the crackle of the fire, the scent of wood smoke and pine, and the quiet, unshakable truth of the home they had made. They had shut the door on the whispers, not in fear, but by choice. Their life was here, within these four walls, and it was more than enough. The closing of the curtain was not an end, but a beginning. It was the final, quiet act of turning inward, a declaration that the small cabin behind the livery was no longer just a shelter, but a sovereign nation of two. The world outside, with its whispers and judgments, could continue its noise. It no longer had the power to breach the walls they had built, both of wood and of will. Life settled into a rhythm as steady and comforting as a heartbeat. The seasons turned, marking the passage of time not in days or weeks, but in shared labor and quiet joys. The baking of bread remained the first ritual of each day. Clara would rise in the cool, blue light of pre-dawn, her movements sure and silent in the familiar geography of her kitchen, the scent of yeast, flour, and the slow, magical transformation of dough would fill their small home, a daily incense of nourishment and stability. It was her work, her art, and her contribution to the small economy of their life together. The healing of horses became the second ritual. Weston's leg mended, leaving him with a slight limp that was more a mark of his history than a hindrance. He moved with a new, deliberate grace, his hands as gentle and knowing as ever. He did not just board horses, he understood them. He took in animals that were skittish or ill-tempered, and with a patience that Clara recognized as a deep and abiding kindness. He would bring them back to a place of trust. The sounds from the new stable, the soft nicker of a horse, the rhythmic rasp of a curry comb, the low, calm murmur of Weston's voice became the background music to their days. The hanging of new curtains was the final, ongoing ritual. As their small savings grew, Clara would occasionally purchase a length of new cloth from a traveling peddler, bypassing the mercantile entirely. She hung new curtains not just on the windows, but to create partitions, to soften the corners of their home, to add a touch of color and warmth against the raw wood. Each new curtain was a small, deliberate act of making their space their own, a continuous affirmation of the world they had chosen. Something fundamental had shifted within Clara. The apologetic stoop that had curved her spine for 27 years was gone, erased not by a conscious effort, but by the simple, daily act of living a life that required her to stand tall. She no longer sought to shrink herself, to take up less space. Her height was no longer a burden to be hidden, but a simple fact of her being. as unremarkable as the color of her eyes. When she walked into town now, she did not hurry. She did not keep her gaze fixed on the muddy ground. She walked with a steady, unhurried pace, her shoulders back, her head level. She saw the stares, the way conversation still sometimes faltered at her approach. But it no longer pierced her. It was simply the weather of the town, as predictable and impersonal as the winter wind. She would meet the gazes of the women who had whispered about her, not with defiance, but with a calm, neutral clarity that was far more disarming. She was Mrs. Mayfield's baker. She was Weston Calhoun's partner, and she was Clara Monroe. She was a fact, and she no longer required their approval to exist. One morning, she saw Elias Thorne leaving the church. He was with his small, quiet wife, who was now expecting their first child. He saw Clara, and a flicker of the old, familiar shame crossed his face. He quickly looked away, murmuring something to his wife and steering her across the street. Clara watched him go, and felt nothing. Not anger, not pity, not even the ghost of a sting. He was a man from a different life, a character in a story that had long since ended. Her path had diverged so completely from his that he was now nothing more than a stranger. Her relationship with Weston deepened in the quiet spaces between their work. It was a love that lived in the details. It was in the heavy wooden baking table he built for her, its surface sanded smooth as glass, its height perfectly suited to her own, so she would never have to stoop while she worked. It was in the way she would sit with him in the stable in the evenings, stitching a torn harness while he spoke quietly to a nervous colt, her calm, steady presence, a part of the healing. It was in the shared glance across the dinner table, a look that could convey a whole day's worth of news, of frustrations, of small victories, without a single word being spoken. They were two tall, solitary trees that had, through a storm, grown so close that their roots had intertwined, drawing strength from the same earth, reaching for the same sky. Winter finally broke, surrendering its hold in a great, messy thaw. The prairie, which had been a stark canvas of white and gray, began to blush with the pale, tender green of new life. The air grew soft, carrying the scent of damp earth and the distant promise of wildflowers. With the spring came a sense of renewal, a feeling that the world, like them, was ready to begin again. It was Agnes Mayfield who found it. She had gone to the Mercantile early one morning and had seen it tacked to the community notice board, a piece of clean brown wrapping paper held in place by a single, shiny nail. The handwriting was unfamiliar, a neat, deliberate script, not the scrawl of a man, nor the delicate loops of a society lady. It was the hand of someone who had thought carefully about their words. She took it down and walked, with a purpose that was faster than her usual stride, to the cabin behind the livery. She found Clara kneading a great mound of dough, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, a fine dusting of flour on her cheek. "Clara," Agnes said, her voice holding a strange, emotional tremor. She held out the piece of paper. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and took it. She read the words, once, and then again. Weston, hearing Agnes's voice, came in from the stable, bringing the scent of horse and leather with him. He saw the paper in Clara's hand, saw the look on her face, a look of stunned, luminous disbelief. He came and stood behind her, his large frame a warm, solid presence at her back, and read the words over her shoulder. On the brown paper, in neat black ink, it said, "Asterisk, the best bread in Logan's Ferry. From the woman who dares to live as she pleases. Asterisk." Clara's hand, the one holding the paper, began to tremble. A single tear, hot and slow, escaped her eye and traced a path through the flour on her cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow or of pain. It was a tear of profound, overwhelming release. It was the acknowledgement she had never sought but had, in her deepest heart, yearned for. It was not from a friend. It was not from an admirer. It was from the town itself. Not the loud, gossiping, fearful part of the town, but the quiet, watching, decent part that had, in the end, seen the truth. They had seen her skill, her work, her contribution, and they had seen her character, her courage, her quiet defiance, her refusal to be made small. Someone had looked past her height, past the whispers, past the scandal, and had seen the value that Elias Thorne had been too blind and too afraid to recognize. Weston's hand came to rest on her shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. He said nothing. He simply stood with her, sharing the moment. She leaned back against him, the paper crinkling in her hand, and together they looked around the small, warm cabin they had built from the ashes. The morning sun streamed through the clean curtains, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The scent of rising bread filled the room. Outside, a horse nickered softly in the new stable. It was not an ending. It was a beginning of a life lived not in defiance of the world, but in accordance with a truth they had forged for themselves. A life where a woman could stand tall, not because she was seeking notice, but because it was, quite simply, who she was, and in the quiet heart of the Wild West, in a small town that was slowly, grudgingly, learning the meaning of courage. That was more than enough. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. To help this story reach even more listeners, please consider hitting the hype button to show your support.